So I think we'll get started. I think Peter really needs no introduction to this group, but I don't know if everybody knows that Peter's recently moved to UCLA to design media arts there. And you all probably know his earlier books like Digital Dialectics, Snap to Grid, and User, but Peter's also coming out with a new book with an interesting and provocative title, Secret War Between Downloading and Uploading. And
the first presentation of which was at the first of your digital culture class,
awesome.
Which was way too long ago, and the book's still not out. But
right. Well, it's great to have you back out here, and we're looking forward to the talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. This is my first time in a true crosstown rivalry. Art Center and CalArts, they didn't have much, what was it going to be? Orange Dots versus Valencians? Trojans Bruins seems to have a bit more cachet, but I do come in peace. And besides, you have a very strong football team this year. So I thought I'd talk essentially about some thoughts that I generated in the course of close to 15 years of teaching at a private art school, teaching designers, and really coming through my exposure and lots of talking with Brenda Laurel to see them as culture makers and to think about what it is to train culture makers, because I think that probably most of the people in this room are involved with that in some form or another. And the title of today's talk is Bespoke Futures, Addressing the Vision Deficit. And this is very much a product of the Bush-Cheney era. And I was actually going to start with the image by the comic book artist Alex Ross, which was my favorite image from the campaign, which was of Obama ripping open his shirt with an O underneath, and it was Super Obama, which I actually thought was a more interesting image than Shep Ferry's Hope image, which was the one that really went everywhere. But there's very interesting reasons why Shep's image resonated the way it did. It was his understanding of networks and open sources and street culture that really propelled that particular image. And if you'd like to, I have both those images somewhere on my computer and we can talk about them later. But what I want to start with was mutants in the Rose Bowl. When a couple of years ago, I was talking to one of my grad students and he showed me this image. And he was an award-winning illustrator. This was part of a series that won an Adobe Illustrator Award, actually. And I asked him what it was, and he said, well, I was asked to embody and show the future. And I said, oh, what are we looking at? Oh, this is the bombed-out Rose Bowl. It's filled with a few humans who aren't mutants, and they're defending themselves from the flesh eaters. I thought to myself, great. This is our default. You ask a talented, young, smart kid who really, has the world in front of him, what's the future look like? And it involves him barricading himself. I'm assuming he's not seeing himself as a flesh eater, right? He's barricading himself in a post-apocalyptic environment, right? Defending himself from evil and terror and, well, zombies who, the thing is, zombies like an all-brain diet. Come Thanksgiving, they have brains. Christmas, they have brains. They're just, zombies like brains. So what can we do about that? How is it possible that we've got such a vision deficit in these kids that we're teaching? How do you get them to think about a future that they actually want to live in? And if you're working with people who have the kinds of skills to render worlds, right? I mean, this is him doing that off the top of his head, basically. If they can't imagine a world that they'd want to live in, we're in bad shape. So I think as we hurtle into the 21st century, we're about ready to hit the second decade of the 21st century. And when you think about what was going on, well, don't think too much about what happened in the second decade of the 20th century, because that was the First World War, which happened after a period of serious deflation and economic crises. But we're not going to think about that. I think that one of the reasons we have so little faith in the future is that the shape of things to come has never really been so inadequately imagined. I think a lot of you in this room know Norman Klein's work on the imaginary 20th century. Norman's been tracking down literally hundreds, if not thousands, of envisionings of what the 20th century was going to look like from the end of the 19th through the start of the 20th century. These were private visions, these were public visions. Right now, I actually think it would be hard-pressed for you guys as a group to find a really compelling set of thought-through images of what this century that we're already in, that we're heading into the second decade of, is going to look like. And certainly you'd be harder pressed to find images that you'd want to live in. Right? So I've been talking to students about this. And what's interesting is when you talk to them about utopia, utopia is relentlessly personal. They can see themselves carving out a little, patch of greenery inside the Rose Bowl and living a happy life and finding a partner and perhaps, building a practice and even, they don't talk that much about kids, but sometimes they do, right? So kind of continuing the species. But their utopias are not social. They are personal. What is social is their dystopia. They all have one image in their head, and that is an oil field on fire with someone running at them with an AK-47 blazing. I mean, that's the shared, if you ask them what the shared social vision is, that's one they can come up with and sort of agree, oh yeah, that's possible. Yeah, I can see that. Asking them for a shared utopian vision, they don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, Wally's going, really?
How about Second Life?
I don't know if they see that as, I mean, I don't see that as utopian. I see that, Second Life is something you can play in the Rose Bowl when the mutants are coming at you. I see that as another kind of personal kind of place, even if it's social. And I certainly don't see it as a utopia. I mean, and I don't see it as having a kind of social ramification. But we can get back to that. Okay. This explains why a movie like Children of Men resonates for them, but they can't imagine a film in which a better future is portrayed as well and as well and as eloquently. Come back, good. One of my students told me, I keep forgetting to install this thing that keeps it from going to sleep. So knock modernism if you choose, but at least the art, design, and architecture generated in that heady period put forth a panoply of futures seductive enough to inspire others to bring them into being. So there was no vision deficit in modernism. It's not to say that all the modern visions were something that we wanted to live with. And when we did build this, we ended up tearing it down or complaining about it. But when you think of these radiant cities, when you think about the belief in a kind of perfection of communication through typographic unity in modernism, this is Helvetica, right? That became the corporate communication device. If you think about that lost dream of ours of space, Strings for a Space Age by Bobby Christian and his orchestra, and I see this as extending all the way into that era of virtual reality. I mean, getting back to Second Life. For some reason I can't find a good high-res image of her with her hair blowing back. I love that one. It's a family inheritance, right? Yes, I need to get that. Is it live or is it Memorex concept? So Even this kind of 90s flash, dot-com era, post-economic, remember that phrase? Everybody was going to be post-economic in 1998. I mean, people would actually say that. How's it going? Oh, I should be post-economic in about a year or two. That was because they were going to cash out, and then they were going to be able to do what they wanted to do. There were a surplus of futurities, even up through then, but I think really this decade has been rough on our concept of futurity. And in a longer version of this talk, I have the inevitable, I think you can talk about a period that we've just gone through as being what I call post-89-11, 8-9-1-1. And what that is that unites the period of 89, right, and the kind of exuberance of a post-historical imaginary with its closure in 9/11. With the events in Mumbai, obviously, we're not through that 9/11 period and its reactions. And I think that, it's not that surprising that that kind of modernist trajectory came to a dead halt, but I do not think we can live without something to keep us going. I think we have seen what a world in which all of our imaginaries are fear-driven has led us to. So how do you deal with that, right? If these culture makers, these people in our film and television and design and media art departments, and the people that we're training to be visually competent in our history departments and in our sociology and our journalism schools, if we cannot train them to visualize a future that they actually want to live in, we need to ask ourselves why not, and we need to potentially come up with modes and methodologies that will allow us to do so. So I think part of the issue that I'm going to talk about today is a little design-centric, but I wanted to talk about what I call Trans Nat Corp Des Edu. That's a registered trademark. 100 years ago, if you were at the Royal College of Art in London, the ultimate point of the curriculum was to produce designers, specifically industrial designers, who could better the commerce of the British Empire. There were similar academies all across Europe established to promote German, Italian, Danish, and other national industries. One of the things people forget about the Bauhaus is that it was originally set up literally to support a specific region's industrial production. It was not set up to be a utopian dream factory. Right? It grew out of various initiatives set up mostly by princes in small principalities to increase their own economic pie. This model has hardly disappeared, as you can see from even the most casual reading of mission statements for recently founded educational initiatives like Designium in Finland, LSCA in Singapore, and the School of Creative Media at the City University of Hong Kong. I was just there last week doing an evaluation of their program, and believe me, they are thinking about how to increase the design and visualization capacities of Hong Kong in particular. I mean, they talk about, city, region, and international, but it's really city and region first. Now, but in many other schools, that sense of service to a national enterprise is not just suspect, but actually contradictory. Many elite institutions, and even not so elite ones, just don't just attract a diverse international student body. They depend upon the tuition of foreign students to support their schools. At my former institution, Art Center, and I'll be showing lots of modernist visions of utopia just in showing the schools I've been teaching at. That's Craig Elwood on the top, Daly Genick on the bottom. That's the old building and the new building there. Over the past 2 decades, you could trace the development of other national design economies by the makeup of their international student bodies. Japanese in the 80s, Korean in the 90s, and the growing influx of Indians and Chinese now. On the one hand, this is not surprising. As capitalism globalized, why should design and the education of culture makers not follow suit? At UCLA, where I am now, redo by Richard Meyer, the worst architect of 2 millennia. I like, this I can live with. The rest of his stuff is crap. Name me a worse architect who worked across 2 millennia. It's impossible. You know, the Sarah's great. Yeah, the Sarah's great. It's the Meyer. Right, all right. That's true. And I got a beautiful view of that Sarah, right down in the middle. Yeah, no, it's very nice.
Worth moving for that.
What?
Worth moving for that.
Yeah, believe me, it certainly is. Okay, so I have an equally international body of graduate students at UCLA. I have yet to teach any undergrads. That'll start next quarter. I'll tell you what that's like. You guys know what your own student bodies are like. But I actually don't see an institution like UCLA or USC promoting the city of Los Angeles, the state of California, or the United States of America so much as I see you as, and us, as participating in a sort of global educational initiative. I mean, I think both individually and as an institution, certainly there's not that kind of attention that I just saw at the City University of Hong Kong to, you know, the region itself or even the country. So what do we do? Well, I think we spend a lot of time getting people ready for this, for the kind of transnational corporate design education, or transnat des edu. Of course, designers will work for these multinationals, but what replaces that sense that one's creative practice feeds more than the client's bottom line? That one's work contributes to a greater communal goal, right? Or greater communal good. And it's here that I'd say that, and again, I'm using a language specific to design, this notion of a client. But of course, anybody in any business knows that there are, you know, there tends to be a boss man. And you tend to work within that no matter how you set this up. And I think the entire discourse of fine art since about 1955 onwards has been about identifying, you know, Hans Hake's work is all about, like, who's my boss man and how do I fight that person? But if you think about recasting, you know, so many designers and so many people try to think of a bit of pro bono work, right? Building in that kind of service component into their own practice. Well, what I would say is, why not think of the future as a client? In a global economy, when the nationalist impulse is either outmoded or suspect, I propose a new model of this kind of education of the creative professional, the ITCP person, what, you know, fill in the blank of who it is that you are training, right? One that can in fact be carried over into their professional practices. Why not posit the future itself as one of their chief clients? More than that, why not pick a better future as that client? In other words, think of the future as either a pro bono client or a partner in an entrepreneurial enterprise. Both of these strategies take payment, much less profit, off the table for at least the time being. Taking the future as a client also gives the designer a certain space to breathe. Individual clients don't have the right to all of a designer's time and creativity. Clients can be cranky, they can be wrong, and they can be complete pains in the ass. So, accept that the future will be exactly the same way. Right? The future, unknowable and always in the process of formation, can be just as cantankerous and even worse than any other client. But you keep working. Right? You negotiate what that creative space is. All well and good, you might say, but how can we adopt the future as a client, and what methods are available to us? One that I've been exploring is scenario planning, or as I'll explain later, the development of bespoke futures. Over the last quarter century, far-sighted multinationals have institutionalized scenario planning to ponder upcoming conditions and their effects on long-term profit and loss. Some of the better-known successes of this scenario planning process were Royal Dutch Shell's ability to plan successfully for expansions and contractions of the global oil demand after the price shocks of the 1970s. It's really Shell that is the locus for the kind of scenario planning that I'm going to be talking about today. And those of you who know that literature, it might be better to discuss the intricacies of it, because I'm just going to offer this as somewhat of an introduction today. Another famous scenario planning was the scenario planning that the South African government did just prior to the end of apartheid. And they really sat down and said, how could we move forward into the future in a way with the African National Congress where the entire country won't, I mean, essentially they looked at a low road where the country dissolves, a middle road where things just proceeded apace, and then a high road that they gave, I think they called that the stork option because it brings a baby, and I mean, naming is very important to that. And another famous one was the development of Smith & Hawkins gardening tools. That company came right out of scenario planning. They sat down and they said, well, what happens if the economy goes down? What happens if it stays where it is? What happens if it goes up? And could you do a high-end gardening company that would work in all three scenarios, and how would you do that? And they built Smith & Hawkins directly out of that modeling. Okay, so scenario planning, as we inherit it from essentially business and a few nonprofits, tends to identify 5 key driving forces at the outset, like society, technology, economics, politics, and the environment, like breaking it down and analyzing things. All right, these identified scenario drivers are then allayed in a spectrum across one axis, a matrix with 2 axes, giving you obviously 4 2D spaces, or a volume with 3 axes, and then you get into some pretty sophisticated computer modeling, and it's interesting. So I'm interested in taking this corporate scenario planning process and perverting its methodologies, audiences, and outcomes, creating what I call bespoke futures, referencing clothing that is custom made. So what is bespoke? It comes to us as a term from the 17th century, when English gentlemen would go in to their tailors, and their tailors were pretty much the only places that you could find cloth. And you'd look at bolts of cloth, and you'd point at it, and if someone else had come in before you to take that particular cloth and say, I'd like that for my clothes, the tailor would say, I'm sorry, that's been spoken for. So been spoken for is collapsed into bespoke. And bespoke clothing is tailor-made for the individual. So when you do a bespoke futures exercise, one of the classic places to start, or classic, how can it be classic? I just started doing it a couple of years ago. One of the new and innovative ways to do it is to start with a whiteboard, right? And just take those technology and social drivers, start laying them out, and start working with the students to develop something. And I've had some concerns raised about the kind of aristocratic trappings of the bespoke, like why am I using that as a term? It's because each one of these is going to be individually tailored, not just for the situation, but also for the maker. And I think that that's very important. It also gets us out of this notion that corporate scenario planning, and we'll get to that, gets you to a certain kind of truth. Right now, I'm just interested in this as a methodology to kind of increase our capacity for vision making. So what I'm interested in is to move from P&L to V&F. That is, from profit and loss to vision and futurity. From ROI to ROV. From the return on investment to the return on vision. So how are we to craft these custom-made futures? I follow a situationist strategy and to turn Peter Schwartz's influential and popular book on the process, The Art of the Long View, which is up there, which distills the scenario and strategy work of his consultancy, the Global Business Network, or GBN, which has been involved with this for decades. And the GBN, for those of you associated with Annenberg, their they're really hooked in with a lot of the same people that you're interested in. I mean, people like Bruce Sterling have been involved with them for years. The Media Lab has been heavily involved with them. They were co-founded by, who is the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog? I am blanking. Stuart Brand, thank you. And so there's a strong connection with the kind of work and interest that certainly I've seen coming out of Annenberg, IML, and other institutes here at USC. So what we can do is we can take a look at the 10 models, or the 10 steps that Schwartz proposes, right? When you're doing scenario planning. Stay focused. Right? Keep it simple. Keep it interactive. Plan to plan and allow enough time. Don't settle for simple high, medium, and low plots. Avoid probabilities or most likely plots. Their key advice is don't fixate on just one scenario that you want to achieve. Avoid drafting too many scenarios. Invent catchy names for those scenarios. Make the decision makers own the scenarios. And budget sufficient resources for communicating those scenarios. All good advice, all advice that anyone doing this kind of planning might want to follow. But let's shift this. How can you turn this into more of this bespoke process intended for the individual who wants to start thinking about how to increase their own capacity to create visions of, again, a future they'd actually want to live in? So instead of staying focused, stay visionary. Instead of keeping it simple, keep it complex. Really think about how complexity works with this. Keep it interactive. You've got to design it interactive and interactively. Plan to plan and allow enough time. Plan for serendipity and allow enough space. Don't settle for simple high, medium, low plots. I think that there's only so much time in this world. Aim high. Avoid probabilities or most likely plots. I say fixate on just that one scenario that you want to achieve. Avoid drafting too many scenarios. This number 7 comes from years of working on the concept of crit culture, which comes out of art schools and design schools, where basically you've got to generate enough ideas that you can kill as many of them as possible. It's a winnowing process. It's brutal, but it's really the only way that it works. Invent catchy. What? I think that's, yeah, I think that this is sort of personal, and I think that what you want to do is, within crits, if they're a general crit, you start to find a kind of communal discussion of what works. It's not always what's best in general. It can be, again, what's best for the specific artist or designer, like what's going to move their practice forward. That's another defining element of what best is. Make the decisions makers own the scenario, own your own scenarios. And then 10, it was really hard to determine this because, budgeting sufficient resources, that's a hard one to not just agree with. But I tried to come up with generate sufficient fervor to communicate the scenarios. So in other words, generate something that you believe in enough to take it out. So I'll start closing this part of the talk off by discussing what I mean by being strategically hopeful. This was also a pre-Obama concept, and it's just been really amazing to see how that word hope has functioned within the culture in the last 6 months to a year. My first instruction to the students is that I want no images of oil fields on fire. And so one of the best projects I ever got, what was the first thing I got? Why? Why did I get these images of oil fields on fire? Because he said to me, I have to get it out of my system. And I said, okay, that's fair enough. And this same student, very interesting, he's in Dubai right now. it was only after he finished his grad work that he explained to me, oh, all of my grad work has actually been about trying to find a way to function as a Muslim in the West and to create these negotiations. And he had hideous problems with his family because he'd married somebody from a slightly different environment, and we had to hire guards for graduation. It was really crazy. I mean, he really, his work was driven by something very meaningful. He started with, thinking about, well, what if we could use stones as our repositories for memory, and stones become these kind of archives of history, and then, then what if we start using stars as our routers for this, and neutral countries hold the greatest economic strength in this, and he's just trying to think of these new networks and really thinking about memory, and then this evolved into an infinite alphabet. And I said, well, how can you use an infinite alphabet? An infinite alphabet doesn't have an. And he said, well, an infinite alphabet might allow us to express an infinite number of exactly those hopeful things that I'm looking for. And again, look, he owns the largest printing press in Dubai right now. That's where he ended up. He actually went working for Landor, which is a huge international branding company, but his family was in printing in Tanzania. But then it's just interesting. He's found what he wants to do, but this was part of a process. Again, if only for that one seminar, I wanted him to be able to kind of work this out. And I mean, this is an interesting place if you're a typographer, if you're a designer, if you're thinking about communication, and just what is an infinite alphabet, right? Of what parts should it consist? Is there such a thing? Is it possible to create an infinite alphabet, or is that not, again, my first question, well, an infinite alphabet isn't an alphabet. But those are precisely the kinds of issues that I wanted to get to. And so, I have other sort of images, if we want to, in the Q&A I can pull up of other students' work, but I wanted to be relatively focused in this talk, and I thought it would be worth bringing up William McDonough's quote, that we have to become strategically hopeful. Again, this is from his book Cradle to Cradle, which some of you may know. It was a very important book in industrial design discourses. It's also a book you can take into the bathtub because it's printed on waterproof semi-paper that's all reconstituted and can be reconstituted back into whatever it was constituted from, I suppose after you take a bath with it. It's not the sort of book you bring into the bath anyway, but that's the way it goes. I think I'm going to skip that slide. And, being strategically hopeful is a leap into the void. And this is, Yves Klein's great photograph of himself just leaping. It's a pre-Photoshop image. You don't necessarily have to. You can leap into the void with a mattress underneath you and then just put in a different background, as he did. So the issue then for me is how do you do this? What are the strategies? And again, this is a mix of kind of pedagogical discussion today and theoretical intervention. And since leaving Art Center and going to UCLA, I've been trying to take some of these ideas and moving it into yet another kind of hybrid space. And so I'll finish today. You thought you were finished already, didn't you? No, it's an academic talk. Never quite finishes. There's no finishing when you have a coda. So I wanted to close with discussing the fox and the hedgehog. Those of you who have read Isaiah Berlin's famed essay about Tolstoy will know that Berlin tried in sort of mid-last century, to categorize the ways in which artists and thinkers encounter and deal with the world. The hedgehog's great depth is inspiring for its rigor, the fox's curiosity astonishing in its energy. And he goes through and identifies, Aristotle is a fox because he's always looking around. Plato is interested in the ideal and the true, so he's a hedgehog. He talks about Dostoevsky as being interested in that one thing, man's relationship to God. And he talks about Pushkin as being all over the place and looking and exploring. And he says that, and this is really an essay about Tolstoy. And he says Tolstoy is a fox who thinks he's a hedgehog. And he thinks that that's what's interesting about him. And I was always interested in this, and I thought to myself, well, if there's one thing that we know, it's that the computer and the digital has created as a default for us and for our students the position of the fox. It is almost inescapable to be a fox today, right? One is pushed, one is drawn around. The rewards for relentless investigation are huge, right? The kind of the joyous pop-ups are remarkable. So that's not going to go away, and it's not something I want to go away. I think a world of hedgehogs doesn't interest me, but a world without people with the capacity to dig deep is not one I want to live in either. And I think that, again, to get to that kind of bespoke future, to get to that kind of thought, we have to eventually find certain areas or pockets and go deeper within that. So I'm interested in the hedge fox. And I've been doing a lot of work in the digital humanities, and I'm wondering, can the digital humanities teach us how to transform ourselves and our students into hedge foxes? Now, the interesting thing is the hedgehog has hybridized in the past. We know this from our reading of Rudyard Kipling and the Just So stories. Now someone's going to say, but they're not true. But they are fun. So who are we looking at? This is a picture of the whole story of the jaguar and the hedgehog and the tortoise and the armadillo all in a heap. It looks rather the same way any way you turn it. The tortoise is in the middle, learning how to bend, and that is why the shelly plates on his back are so spread apart. He is standing on the hedgehog, who is waiting to learn how to swim. The hedgehog is a Japanese hedgehog, because I couldn't find our own hedgehogs in the garden when I wanted to draw them. It was daytime, and they'd gone under the dahlias. Speckly Jaguar is looking over the edge with his patty paw carefully tied up by his mother because he has pricked himself scooping the hedgehog. He's much surprised to see what the tortoise is doing, and his paw is hurting him. The snouty thing with the little eye that Speckly Jaguar is trying to climb over is the armadillo that the tortoise and the hedgehog are turning into when they have finished bending and swimming. It is all a magic picture, and that is one of the reasons why I haven't drawn the jaguar's whiskers. The other reason was that he was so young that his whiskers had not grown. The jaguar's pet name with his mummy was Doffles. So I will leave you with this image of a hybrid creature, the armadillo, that Kipling talked about in his Just So stories about the origin of the world. And I'll say that I have yet to see a good picture of a hedge fox. I've had a couple already sent to me. But anyone who wants to do a picture of a hedge fox, I'd love to see what it looks like, and I'm hoping to see more running around our groves of academe. So thank you very much. Yeah?
So it seems to me, if you think about the history of science fiction, it's always dystopian, or pretty much. I mean, certainly when I think about the movies, you start at Metropolis and go forward.
Right.
It's very hard to find a non-dystopian science fiction movie. So is it not a part of the artist? I mean, Marcuse would have said that the artist's role is the great refusal.
Right.
He has to paint the pictures of the burning, oil wells. That's his role to get a society which is basically narcotized to wake up. And maybe the only way you can make it wake up is by saying, this is where you're going. Blade Runner is your future, Los Angeles. You get in,
Right. Blade Runner was our future. It's 1982.
Yeah.
it's as dated now, and I love Blade Runner, I want to do a Blade Runner reader soon. It's as dated now for our 20-year-old students as Voyage to the Moon was in 1982. It's a similar kind of distance. I think that actually there was a lot of science fiction that did propose a certain kind of futurity that people wanted to live in. That's one of the enduring reasons that Star Trek is still with us. And I think that there have been various kinds of stories, there have been various kinds of ways to contemplate the future, not necessarily all narrative driven. A lot of them are illustrative. And I think that that's something we kind of lost, that sort of, that popular science in 1975, when you have your jetpack, and I should have worn my where's my fucking jetpack pin that they gave me as my going away. Instead of a watch, they gave me a pin that said, where's my fucking jetpack? I appreciate it more than a watch. So I would say that the role of the artist is regularly to refuse. Right now, what they have to refuse is a certain amount of negativity and corporatized fear and militarized fear that is built into our culture right now and our vision of the world. And I think that, is this going to work for everybody? Absolutely not. Some artists.
I didn't mean to say
right.
that I don't support the project. Because
right.
I think what you're doing is incredibly important. But I'm just saying that the general gist of the media that our students have been exposed to has been dystopian in the extreme.
Exactly.
For a long time.
Right. But the general gist of the media that our students have been exposed to, that's precisely why they come to study other things. I mean, that's one of my interests in exposing alternate narratives, alternate discourses. Absolutely, cultural critique and the critique of society as it exists is going to be a central part of all creative practice. It's why artists stand obliquely to the culture for the most part. If they don't, they join fraternities and become Big Ten accountants. But the other interesting thing is, I'm also trying to take into account the fact that the corporate has engaged with precisely this kind of positioning of itself over the last 40 years, essentially. And I think Thomas Frank's first book, actually, was his dissertation in American Studies at U of Chicago that was then turned into a book called The Commodification of Cool. And it's worth taking a look at because he really identifies the strategies that advertisers in particular and essentially the entire world of, and you can't call it late capitalism because you don't know where we are in capitalism. Whatever stage of capitalism was happening in the post-war era of the 60s to now, it was very much about a certain kind of engagement with precisely the strategies of avant-gardism that then rendered the avant-garde completely useless as a category. I never use the term. I think it is like a horse that has been ridden for too long, too hard, and may not be dead, but it's panting, and we really have to get off it for a while. And when I look at things like YouTube, and I look at Flickr, and I look at Cool Hunting, and I look at all of those things, the running room, that distance between what were once avant-gardists and contemporary marketers has shrunk to literally nothing. And so I think that that's one of the things that we have to deal with as a group. The Academy's nostalgia for the avant-garde is overwhelming, right? People cannot live without that category, even though I think it's completely and utterly useless in 2008. Yeah, Steve.
So I'm not responding to that. But I wondered if you wanted to comment on the Superstruct game, which seemed, coming out of Institute for the Future, which seems to be mapping on exactly to the trajectory that you're talking about between individual dystopia to social utopia. It's explicitly constructed to invite that narrative.
English professors, whenever a book comes up, always say, as I was rereading, how do I acknowledge without looking ignorant that I haven't even looked at the game yet? So that's my fault. But can we rephrase that in a way? Well, tell me more, Steve.
Interesting, I think, counterpoint, the superstruct, and it's play the game, invent the future. You imagine a future 10 years in advance, and they even structure into it a bunch of the kind of dystopian elements, like what's going to happen with the environment, what's going to happen with toxic
Well, there are four really negative scenarios that you start with.
That you start with, but the idea is to work through those just as your students started with the burning oil fields, and eventually collectively are intended to articulate a utopian future that works through those problems.
I absolutely, you see this even like British Petroleum. Oh, no, it's not British Petroleum. Now it's called Beyond Petroleum. What filthy liars. But BP and others are creating their own scenario building games online that are available to whom? Who's going on BP's scenario building game? But it's available. I think that, again, I'm hoping that speaks to a kind of hunger. I'm hoping that this piece, which I've been working on for a couple of years, and actually there's a short version of this online at the Adobe think tank site. So you can just go to the adobe.com site and you'll find your way eventually to think tank or just do. Oh, well, it's called influence. One hopes. But no, I don't think, I doubt it's a ripoff. I think it is a part of this delayed millennial moment. I mean, I honestly think that, the kind of hope that one of the forgotten big fears is Y2K, right? That was one of those things that really prevented us from engaging with this new century, that kind of hysteria that was generated around that. But that was a hysteria that was actually, when I was writing about that in User, the piece was called Teotwaki, which is Teotwaki, which is an acronym for the end of the world as we know it. And that was very much about our dystopian imaginary, but it was also a real general understanding that we built an information ecology that nobody understood and that even fewer people had quote unquote control or command over. The great military objective of C³I, command, control, communication, and information, we lost that. We knew that the world was it was running, but no one quite knew how it was running. And I think we've seen that in a series of bubbles and shocks since that period. It's interesting how much people are starting to refer back to the Asian economic crisis of, what was that, 97, 98? I had a friend from college who, in that period, went, and he was a vice president of Morgan Stanley. He owned 1/4 of the car loans in Thailand. He just went in and bought them up. That was his job. And we were talking, and he just said, "I now own 1/4 of the car loans in Thailand, and I don't know how this is going to work out." And it worked out fine. That one worked out fine. That was, we've gone through a number of successive shocks that kind of worked out fine, and this one's kind of not working out fine. But if it does, it makes me worry about hubris. But that's a whole other talk. But so my answer to that is, I haven't seen it, but I will. Thank you for the link. Yeah, Wally.
So I have a question about how students outside the U.S. view this vision thing. I can understand how oil wells burning would be part of the vernacular here in Los Angeles and other Western capitals, but when you go to Bangalore, or when you go to Hong Kong, or to Dubai, what do students there think of the future?
I think that they think they're going to have a lot more to do with making it. I think that they're very, very interested in it. I mean, a couple of years ago, I started to think through, like, what were the 3 future-oriented agendas, right? And the first was a kind of fundamentalist one of Sharia, right, no, there you go, of Sharia or rapture. And this was my favorite image that was generated from this. This is a vernacular painting that I just found on the web. And this is a portrait of the rapture. And this is pre-9/11. So that's Jesus. And those are souls flying out of their cars. You may remember those bumper stickers, like, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. And then the response, which was, in case of rapture, can I have your car? But, I mean, what, of course, is so terrifying about this image is for some reason, the Christian right was obsessed with airline pilots, the righteousness of airline pilots. And that came directly out of the Left Behind series. Right, and so what do you have here? I actually really want a sinful airline pilot who's like swinging with stewardesses, because they're the only ones who will land the plane, right? The good ones, they just go straight up and leave you there. And that, I mean, this still appeals to far too many people, yeah.
It was often rumored but never proven that the Bush administration had a plan on what to do, how to run the government after the rapture.
Well, Martin Goodman would be gone. So who's gonna vet the?
Precisely.
Why don't you just leave it to the sinners? I think that there's a certain. I mean, another one of those goal-oriented agenda or future-oriented agendas was Asian triumphalism, as exemplified by Rem Koolhaas, right? That there is a kind of excitement right now in all over. I mean, I'm fascinated to find out, like, what this economic downturn is going to do to China, and what it's going to. I'm fascinated and terrified about what it's going to do to precisely this. When the engine starts to slow down, where do we go? And then
We've got $3 trillion of treasury bills.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out. If they try and cash it, they don't have $3 trillion worth of treasury bills. Yeah. No.
These are still visions by old white guys. And what do the students think about this?
Well, I think this is a vision that this kind of European Zivilmacht is something that
the kind of soft power that I think that there's a huge desire that I see to have this Libertas Español, which is a very interesting movie about the European unification. And it was about people in a Barcelona apartment. And they're all kind of young and they're all over the place. And these are all European movies, so they look great. And so, but when you think about that kind of coming together and being with actually unlikes, if you can communicate with them, I mean, the question was, were they going to speak in Spanish? Were they going to speak in English? I mean, we're in Spain, but some of them are English, some of them are Swedish, some of them are Spanish. The lead character is French. How are they going to communicate those kinds of connections? I'm not sure. What I do know is that the technological imaginary, and this is my favorite image of that, of that technological imaginary, right? This is by a Swiss illustrator who did a lot of Amazing Stories covers in the 20s, and a lot of them were bug-eyed monsters. But this one, look at him rising into the sky. Okay, we can ignore the gender dynamics. I think my daughters aren't interested in the women, waving the handkerchief at the person with the jetpack. They want the jetpack for themselves. But I don't know yet. I need to talk to them more, and I think they need. It's hard to express that sometimes in this culture because you tend to get whacked around for not being realistic. And I think that the other thing that I do not understand why, and I might just not know the literature. I want to know, where is the great book about the impact of debt on student debt on students worldwide. You know, in the U.S. in particular, I mean, when you think, I graduated from college in 1984. I was literally in the last class of students where, at least in private schools, the ratio of grant to debt was on the grant side. Right? In other words, grant to loan, excuse me, I should have said. Every year after that, and it was no surprise that that happened in the Reagan era. Reagan cut his teeth battling it out with students and faculty at the UC, and the moment he became president, he tried to shift that, and he wanted to make sure he and his education people, and they made it impossible to default on student loans. That was also a Reagan era thing, and I think that American students in particular come out burdened with so much debt. I had one student come out with $160,000 in debt. I don't understand how you can do that. And I think that that really cuts down on your capacity to see the future, because you're carrying around the burden of a house without owning a house. And I think and I think we as faculty and as administrators, we're shamefully quiet about that.
And I felt by the end at Art Center, we were charging them, when I left, it was more than $1,000 a week. I'm good, but I don't know if I'm that good. Really. I mean, I really, and this isn't exactly an open university campus, is it, at USC? It's pretty expensive here, too. So, I mean, these are just the kind of questions that need to be answered, which I suppose is my way of avoiding your real question, which is, what do they think? I'm trying to, another year or two, I hope to talk to more, and I hope to travel more. When I was just in China, I think they want to join what they see as the party, right? They want to be at the table, and I think that what they feel they have now is technique, and what they want is expertise. And I don't know how that relates to these vision issues that we're talking about. So, other question? I mean, Mimi?
We should continue the discussion over lunch.
Sure.